So the AP had this remarkable scoop just a week ago that when Trump's Energy Secretary Rick Perry went over to Ukraine in May for the inauguration of the new Ukrainian president, while he was there, he recommended a couple of his top donors from home in Texas to be energy advisors to the new Ukrainian president. At least one of those top donors then, 1 week later, put in a bid for a sweet oil drilling deal on land owned by the Ukrainian government, and he won that contract, a 50-year contract from the Ukrainian government, right after Rick Perry had interceded on his behalf when he was over there doing official U.S. government business and attending that inauguration. That story was broken by the AP last week. Now we've gotten some official under-oath confirmation of that story. It comes from David Holmes, a career Foreign Service officer who was based at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and who testified in the impeachment inquiry on Friday. Mr. Holmes testified behind closed doors on Friday. We're about to hear from him in newly scheduled public testimony as well. But here's what he's testified to already. Quote, in early May, we learned that Vice President Pence no longer planned to lead the presidential delegation to the inauguration in Ukraine. The White House ultimately whittled back an initial proposed list to the inauguration from over a dozen individuals to just 5, with Secretary Perry at its head. The inauguration took place May 20th, and I took notes in the delegation's meeting with President Zelensky. During that meeting, Secretary Perry passed President Zelensky passed him a list of, quote, people he trusts, from whom Zelensky could seek advice on energy sector reform. That was then the topic of subsequent meetings between Secretary Perry and key Ukrainian energy sector contacts, meetings from which U.S. Embassy personnel were excluded by Secretary Perry's staff. Oh, why didn't you want the embassy staff there? Rick Perry is one of the handful of Trump administration officials who suddenly, inexplicably resigned from his high position in government as soon as the impeachment scandal started breaking open. Rick Perry is one of these people for whom his own role is getting stickier and more problematic the more we learn. We also learned from that same Foreign Service officer, David Holmes, in his testimony, we learned about President Trump personally inquiring as to whether Ukraine was going to do the investigations that he wanted. David Holmes overheard a phone call between President Trump and Ambassador Gordon Sondland after Sondland called the president on an unsecured cell phone at a public restaurant in Kyiv. Their conversation was conducted loud enough so that people sitting nearby could hear every word the president said. Remind me what they wanted to lock Hillary Clinton up for again? Oh, yeah. Oh, wait. Just before we got on the air tonight, the impeachment committee's just released the full transcript of David Holmes' closed-door testimony from this weekend, which includes this about that phone call. Quote, let me move ahead to the call that you overheard at the restaurant. You said Ambassador Sondland placed this call on his mobile phone? Answer, yes, sir. Question, did that cause you any concern about the security of the phone call? Answer, it was surprising to me that well, yes. In my experience, generally, phone calls with the president are very sensitive and handled accordingly. Question, and making a cell phone call from Ukraine, is there a risk of the Russians listening in? Answer, I believe at least 2 of the 3, if not all 3 of the mobile networks are owned by Russian companies or have significant stakes in those. We generally assume that mobile communications in Ukraine are being monitored by the Russians. David Holmes also testifies that despite this line that we're now getting from the White House, for the president's supporters in Congress, even sometimes from the president himself, that his pressure on Ukraine to deliver these politically useful investigations was somehow okay because he was very interested in anti-corruption efforts. Not only do we get what Rick Perry was doing on behalf of the Trump administration in Ukraine counterexample for that. He's literally there hooking up his donors with oil and gas drilling contracts while he's there being an official U.S. government envoy. In addition to that, we get new testimony from David Holmes that when the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, when that staff there at the embassy put together a package of actual anti-corruption efforts to pitch to the Trump White House to try to persuade President Trump that he should schedule a White House meeting with the Ukrainian president. Turns out those generic non-specific, not individually targeted anti-corruption efforts that they were preparing and that they were pitching to the president, those were of no interest to President Trump. Quote, within a week or two, it became apparent that the anti-corruption efforts on which we were making progress were not making a dent in terms of persuading the White House to schedule a meeting between the presidents. Turns out the Trump White House wasn't interested in pursuing the anti-corruption stuff. They just wanted investigations into Joe Biden, right? And that is very damning testimony if the defense of the president relies on the idea that he really is all about anti-corruption efforts, and that was really what he was trying to get done there. When the people who actually worked on those things couldn't get their freaking calls returned, right? Couldn't make a dent, is his phrase. Couldn't get anywhere with the Trump White House while they were working on actual anti-corruption because the Trump White House did not care about that. They only cared about getting specific investigations into the president's domestic political rivals. Well, tonight, that career Foreign Service officer, David Holmes, whose closed-door testimony we can now access as of this evening, he has just been added to the list of public impeachment hearing witnesses. He'll be testifying on Thursday afternoon alongside veteran national security official Fiona Hill. Now, tomorrow morning, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern time, we're going to have testimony from two side-by-side witnesses. It'll be Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who's the top Ukraine official on the National Security Council. He'll testify alongside Jennifer Williams, who is a career Foreign Service officer who worked in Vice President Mike Pence's office. You'll recall that Colonel Vindman's testimony made headlines for days after he gave his closed-door deposition. What he recounted, and what turns out to have been quite dramatic testimony, was his reaction to listening in on the call on July 25th between President Trump and President Zelensky, what he thought was so wrong about that call, and what he did immediately after that call wrapped. He went immediately to the National Security Council's top lawyer with his concerns that he might have heard something not just improper, but potentially illegal on that call. Colonel Vindman also explained in his deposition that he took detailed notes on that call about what exactly the two presidents talked about. He said some of the detailed corrections he proposed to the White House notes from that call weren't made, even though he took notes and was asked to give corrections, suggested those corrections, and then they were just not accepted. The official he's going to be testifying alongside tomorrow, Jennifer Williams, in her deposition, she corroborated that from Alexander Vindman. She corroborated that there were specific things discussed on that call that, for whatever reason, weren't included in the official White House notes that were released of that call. Jennifer Williams, like Colonel Vindman, said that the Ukrainian president specifically mentioned this one company, Burisma. That's the specific investigation that President Trump was demanding about Joe Biden. Jennifer Williams, in her testimony, in her deposition, corroborates Colonel Vindman's claim that the Ukrainian president used that word, mentioned that company by name. She says she made a note of it specifically, even though the White House call notes don't reflect that the Ukrainian president ever mentioned that company. Now, that may have just been an oversight by the White House note takers, but it's weird that they didn't take the correction on that when they were told that they missed it. And substantively, if the Ukrainian president did specifically mention that company, what Colonel Vindman has suggested is important about that is that it may indicate that the Ukrainian president wasn't hearing for the first time on that call that the president wanted investigations. It would indicate that he knew exactly which investigations President Trump was asking for, because that call was just part of what had been an ongoing campaign, where those specific investigations of Joe Biden, Burisma, were being demanded of the new Ukrainian president and his government. I should tell you that Jennifer Williams' deposition is also, just in broad terms, just going to be really difficult for the White House to get around. Again, she's a career Foreign Service officer. She's been detailed to the vice president's office. In her deposition, just a selection here, quote, during the July 25th call, did you have any concerns about the conversation that you heard between President Trump and President Zelensky? Jennifer Williams was also, like Colonel Vindman, listening in on that call. Williams answers, quote, I certainly noted that the mention of these specific investigations seemed unusual as compared to other discussions with foreign leaders. I believed those references to be more political in nature, and so that struck me as unusual. Williams says, quote, I believe I found the specific references to be more specific to the president in nature, to his personal political agenda, as opposed to a broader foreign policy objective of the United States. She says, quote, it struck me as unusual and inappropriate. And the follow-up question, well, how did it make you feel? And Williams answers, quote, I guess for me, it shed some light on possible other motivations behind the security assistance hold. It should also be noted that Jennifer Williams is the only official from Vice President Mike Pence's office who's been called to testify in the impeachment proceedings thus far, at least that we know of, to the extent that the vice president's own implication in this scandal really hinges entirely on his assertions and assertions of unnamed people around him that he was totally ignorant of this whole campaign. He didn't know what was going on. He had no idea that President Trump was holding up military aid and making White House meetings and other things contingent on Ukraine, coughing up specific investigations. Vice President Pence was directly involved in this pressure campaign. His defense is that it was unwitting, that he didn't realize what exactly he was pressuring Ukraine to do when he told them they weren't getting their military aid. Jennifer Williams says in her testimony that, well, she worked in Vice President Pence's office advising him on this part of the world. And she says that she specifically flagged for Vice President Pence in his daily briefing, not only the notes from Trump's call with Zelensky, in which Trump pressed for investigations and repeatedly mentioned Joe Biden. She says before that, she specifically flagged for Vice President Pence that Rudy Giuliani was making these public claims saying that he wanted the Ukrainian government to investigate Joe Biden and to investigate the 2016 campaign because that would benefit his client, President Trump. So Jennifer Williams is saying Vice President Pence was advised that this campaign was going on, according to Rudy Giuliani, and that this campaign was being carried out by the president on his calls with the Ukrainian government. So if Vice President Pence wants to say he doesn't know that stuff was happening, he has to pretend he doesn't read, I guess. Jennifer Williams' testimony and Alexander Vindman's testimony tomorrow should both be fascinating. They both start at 9 a.m. In the afternoon, it'll be Tim Morrison and Kurt Volker. Interestingly, both Tim Morrison and Kurt Volker have also resigned their positions in the government just as the impeachment inquiry got underway. Kurt Volker was the U.S. envoy to Ukraine. He likely tomorrow will have to clean up some of his earlier closed-door testimony that has now been contradicted by multiple other witnesses, including issues about his own involvement in pressing Ukraine to announce these investigations if they wanted to get a White House meeting. Tim Morrison's testimony behind closed doors was described by at least one Republican member of the impeachment committees as, quote, alarming. Among the things we learned from Morrison's testimony was that President Trump and John Bolton, the national security right as the hold on the Ukraine military aid was released, President Trump and John Bolton apparently had a one-on-one meeting in the White House in which Tim Morrison says those two men discussed the president's reasons for not wanting to release the military aid to Ukraine. Tim Morrison tells us that that meeting happened, that involved John Bolton and the president, the two of them together. Of course, knowing what happened inside that meeting would depend on testimony from either the president himself, yeah, right, or from John Bolton himself. And the question of Bolton's testimony is still up in the air and very important. Morrison's appearance tomorrow afternoon at this public hearing will further raise the stakes on the question of whether John Bolton himself will come testify. But alongside all of this that has been revealed in these impeachment proceedings, and all of this that's been revealed just since the impeachment proceedings have been conducted in public for this past week, alongside all of that, you know, it's open source reporting that continues to break some of the most interesting stuff here on a day-to-day basis. I mean, yes, there's this inquiry in Congress, but then there's also your morning paper. I mean, the Wall Street Journal this weekend reporting on emails about the pressure campaign on Ukraine, which appear to be some of the communications that were subpoenaed from the State Department. But the State Department hasn't been releasing any of that stuff. Well, the State Department may be trying to hold all that stuff in confidence. They may be trying to keep all that stuff from impeachment investigators. But that paper trail can't be hidden by the State Department alone. Not if all the people involved in this scandal are going to start leaking those emails and communications to the Wall Street Journal so they can report them on the front page. Similarly, the Washington Post reporting this weekend that not only was the pressure campaign on Ukraine putting it The State Department and their White House meeting, which Zelensky still has not had. According to the Washington Post this weekend, Rudy Giuliani reportedly communicated to Ukrainian officials in the middle of this whole mishigas that they weren't even going to get any phone calls with the Trump White House moving forward unless they coughed up those investigations that were being demanded of them. That's new this weekend from Greg Miller, Greg Jaffe, and Paul Stoney at the Washington Post. And then there's the Associated Press. As I mentioned earlier in the show, the Associated Press had that initial, just absolute bombshell scoop about Rick Perry going to the inauguration of the new Ukrainian president. And while he's there on the sideline of the inauguration, handing the new president a piece of paper with his donors' names on it. And then magically, one of those donors gets a gigantic contract from the Ukrainian government 1 week later, right? Odd that, especially while we're working so hard on stopping corruption in Ukraine. But I got to tell you, that same reporting team at the Associated Press that broke that incredible story about Rick Perry, which has now been borne out by sworn testimony, that same reporting team at the AP was also how we learned for the first time that David Holmes, this important new witness, had overheard that phone call at a restaurant in Kyiv between Gordon Sondland and President Trump himself, inquiring about those investigations. The Associated Press was first to report that in addition to David Holmes overhearing that call, there were other witnesses. There were at least one other official who could corroborate Holmes's account because more than one person sitting at that table could hear what Trump was saying on that call. And now that same reporting team at the Associated Press has a new scoop that absolutely guts the latest defense that Republican defenders of the president in Congress have been relying on in these public impeachment hearings. The thing they have been arguing is their strongest case for why President Trump did nothing wrong here. That is right in the bullseye of what the AP just reported in their latest scoop today. And that reporter and that scoop are here next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.